The steel gate slammed hard. 23 years I've lived in Desert Ridge Commons, watched my kids grow up on these streets, paid every assessment without question, but that afternoon, standing in my own driveway with mud still wet on my tires, I looked down at the letter in my hand's notice of upstream liability assessment, requesting my proportional contribution of $285,000 within 30 days, and something felt wrong. This wasn't about the monsoon that had just torn through our neighborhood. This was about something that had been building for a long time. Phoenix sprawls across the Sonoran Desert. Subdivisions blend into each other until you forget where one gated community ends and another begins. But Desert Ridge Commons has always thought it was special. 24-hour guard gate, Italian tile roofs mandated down to the exact shade of terracotta, landscaping so precise you'd think the saguaros signed contracts before they were planted. The kind of neighborhood where people measure their hedges with rulers and call code enforcement if your trash cans are visible past 7 p.m. on collection day. I'm Miguel Herrera, 58 years old, electrician by trade, widower for the last 6. After Maria passed, this house became more than just property. It became the last place her voice echoed. The kitchen where she taught our daughter to make tamales. The garden where she planted roses that still bloom every April without her. I've kept the place up. Kept working, kept living. The HOA never particularly liked that I parked work trucks in my driveway, never liked that I asked questions at meetings instead of nodding along, never liked that I didn't just write checks when they came up with their latest assessment, but they really started having a problem with me after I stood up at that March meeting and pointed out that their new drainage modification plan was going to turn our neighborhood into a swimming pool the first time we got real rain. Summer monsoons in Arizona don't ask permission. The sky goes dark, the temperature drops 20 degrees in 10 minutes, and rain doesn't fall so much as assault the ground. Streets become rivers. Washes that sit dry for 11 months suddenly remember their flood channels. Most folks who've lived here long enough know the drill. You stay off the roads, you don't park in low spots, and you respect the water. Desert Ridge Commons sits in what used to be a natural drainage basin. Developers filled it, graded it, paved it over, and sold it to people who wanted mountain views without the hassle of actual mountains. The original plans included retention basins, proper drainage channels, flood mitigation systems designed to work with the desert. But somewhere between blueprints and reality, corners got cut, budgets got trimmed, and priorities shifted from underground infrastructure to things people could see and photograph. Diane Castellano became HOA president 6 years ago. She treats a homeowners association like it's a Fortune 500 company, and she's the CEO. Everything is about property values, aesthetic standards, community reputation. She runs meetings like board sessions, complete with PowerPoint presentations. When she talks, 3 other board members nod in unison. The treasurer, Paul Kendrick, follows her around, taking notes on a tablet. The compliance chair, Derek Morales, owns a landscaping company that somehow wins every HOA contract. And the architectural committee head, Barbara Simmons, has been Diane's friend since they both moved here. I tried warning them. March meeting, April meeting, May meeting. I stood up with printed reports from the Maricopa County Flood Control District, showed them the topography maps that highlighted our neighborhood as high risk. We're sitting in a bowl, I'd said, pointing at the survey data. The original detention basin, Basin C, right behind the community center, that's not decorative, it's functional. You fill that in for parking. You eliminate the primary overflow capacity for the whole system. Diane had smiled at me the way you smile at a child who doesn't understand. Miguel, we've consulted with certified professionals. Our modifications have been reviewed and approved. The drainage system is perfectly adequate for a 100-year storm event. But I'd seen the actual engineering report. My neighbor, James Morales, had served on the modifications committee until he quit in frustration last December. He'd given me a copy of the assessment written by Elena Ruiz, a hydraulic engineer Diane had hired for the project. Elena's original report had been clear. She'd written in bold text that eliminating Basin C and narrowing the main channel would create critical overflow conditions during any sustained rainfall exceeding 2 inches per hour. She'd recommended against the modifications unless the HOA installed additional retention capacity downstream. According to James, Diane's response had been to ask Elena to revise her findings to reflect cost-effective solutions. When Elena refused to sign off on modifications she considered dangerous, her contract was terminated. Diane hired a different engineer, someone who wrote exactly what she wanted, and the project moved forward. That was 8 months ago. The sky started changing on a Tuesday in early August. Phoenix in August usually means heat that makes the air shimmer, temperatures that crack dashboards. But that morning felt different. Humidity pressed down like weight. Clouds began stacking up against the mountains to the east, dark and heavy, the kind of purple-gray that makes old-timers check their windows and move cars into garages. I was replacing a junction box in my workshop when my phone buzzed with a weather alert. Severe thunderstorm warning. Flash flood watch. Potential for 3 to 4 inches of rain in localized areas. I walked outside and looked at the wash that runs behind my property line. Bone dry, nothing but creosote bushes, and the occasional roadrunner hunting lizards in the gravel. By evening, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. Wind picked up, tearing through the palm trees. I walked my property, checking the drainage swales I dug and maintained myself after the HOA refused to handle them. Water needs somewhere to go. If it can't go where it's supposed to, it goes where it wants. Around 9 p.m., the storm hit. Not gradually. The sky just opened up and poured everything it had been holding. Rain hammered the roof, overflowed the gutters within minutes, turned my backyard into a temporary pond. I stood at my back window watching the wash start to fill. Slowly at first, then faster. Muddy water churning with debris, branches, trash cans, someone's patio furniture tumbling downstream. I was making coffee around 10:30, thinking maybe the worst had passed, when I heard it, a deep, grinding sound that resonated through the ground itself. Not thunder. This was sharp, sustained, the sound of something structural giving way under pressure that had finally become too much. My windows rattled. A picture frame slipped off the wall. I grabbed my raincoat and flashlight, stepped out into the downpour. The wash was roaring now, a muddy torrent maybe 5 feet deep, where it's normally empty sand. But the sound hadn't come from there. It came from downstream, toward the community center, toward the exact spot where Basin C used to be before Diane had authorized filling it in to create 30 additional guest parking spaces. Lightning strobed across the sky, bright enough to turn night into day. In that flash, I saw it. A massive surge of water cresting over what used to be the retention wall, spreading sideways across the park, flooding toward the streets below. I stood there in the rain, water running into my boots, and thought about Elena's report, about the warnings that had been ignored. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat at my kitchen table listening to the rain gradually ease off, watching local news on my laptop as reports came in. Flooding in North Scottsdale, water rescues near Tempe Town Lake, road closures spreading across the valley. But nothing yet about Desert Ridge Commons. Morning came gray and heavy. I drove down toward the community center, had to park 3 blocks away because the main road was underwater. The community center itself, the building Diane had personally overseen renovations for, spending almost $2 million in HOA reserves, sat in 3 feet of brown water. The decorative bridge over the water feature had collapsed completely. The new playground equipment was half buried in mud. And there, standing in the parking lot in designer rain boots, was Diane Castellano. Hair pulled back tight, face set in an expression that was focused. Not shock, not grief. She was talking to a man in khakis and a polo shirt with a company logo I didn't recognize, gesturing toward the wash, pointing upstream repeatedly. He was taking notes on a tablet. She wasn't surveying damage. She was building a narrative. I didn't approach her. I just took photographs with my phone, the flooded center, the collapsed retention wall, the filled-in area where Basin C used to provide overflow capacity. Evidence. In case anyone asked questions later, when I got home, there was already a voicemail on my phone. Diane's voice, crisp and professional. Mr. Herrera, this is Diane Castellano, HOA president. We need to discuss your property's contribution to last night's flooding event. Several homeowners have reported that the surge appeared to originate from the upstream section. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to arrange a site inspection. Contribution. Originated from. The language was already tactical, already setting up the framework for blame. I didn't call back. Instead, I called James Morales. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight. Miguel, you see what happened? I saw it. Did you? I know exactly what she's going to do, he interrupted. She's already doing it. She called me this morning asking about upstream drainage maintenance records. She's building a case that the water came from your section because of inadequate property management. We didn't do anything. The water came from where it always comes from. She just eliminated the system that was supposed to handle it. I know that. You know that. But she's got that assessor walking the property right now, and I guarantee his report is going to say exactly what she wants it to say. I looked out my window at the wash, calmer now, but still running brown. How fast is she moving? James was quiet for a moment. Miguel, she had the assessment company's contact information ready this morning. She's not reacting to the flood. She was prepared for it. That sentence hung in the air between us. You think she knew this would happen? I think she knew it could happen, and she had a plan ready for when it did. And that plan starts with making this someone else's fault. After we hung up, I stood on my back patio for a long time, looking at the water still draining through the wash. Maria used to sit out here with me on evenings like this. She'd been gone 6 years now, but I could still hear her voice clearly. Don't let people make you into what they say you are, Miguel. You know who you are. Make sure everyone else knows it too. The next morning, I found out exactly how fast Diane was moving. Not just one white Mercedes in my driveway at 8 a.m., but 3 different cars over the course of 2 hours. The first was the man in the polo shirt from yesterday, now carrying a leather portfolio and a clipboard. He introduced himself as Rick Stedman from Watershed Assessment Solutions. Mr. Herrera, I'm conducting property evaluations on behalf of the HOA to determine contributing factors to yesterday's flooding event. He spoke like he was reading from a script. I'll need to inspect your drainage systems, landscaping grade, and water management features. You have authorization for that? The HOA covenants allow for property inspection when community safety is at concern. He smiled in a way that suggested he'd given this explanation before. I let him look. Not because I had to, but because I had nothing to hide. He spent 45 minutes walking my property line, taking photos, making notes, measuring slopes with a digital level. When he finished, he didn't provide any findings, just thanked me for my cooperation and left. The second visitor was a woman from my insurance company, responding to a claim I hadn't filed. Apparently, the HOA had submitted a blanket incident report listing multiple upstream properties as potential liability sources. She was polite but thorough, asking about my maintenance practices, drainage modifications, anything that might have altered natural water flow patterns. The third visitor arrived just after noon, a courier, professional and impersonal, handing me a thick envelope that required a signature. Inside was the letter that had brought me to this moment. Notice of upstream liability assessment, printed on HOA letterhead with Diane's signature at the bottom, but it wasn't just addressed to me. Identical letters had been sent to 5 other homeowners in the upstream section: the Castillo family on Saguaro Drive, David and Linda Martinez on Desert Vista, an elderly widow named Mrs. Patterson, a young couple I'd seen at a few meetings named the Johnsons, and a rental property owned by some investor in California. The letter was carefully worded, full of phrases like proportional responsibility and cost recovery framework and community restoration partnership. But the core message was clear. The HOA had sustained approximately $1.8 million in documented damages to community property. An independent assessment had determined that inadequate drainage management on upstream properties had materially contributed to the severity of the flooding. Each upstream property owner was being asked to contribute their proportional share toward restoration costs. My proportional share, based on property size and estimated runoff contribution, was $285,000, payable within 30 days. Or the HOA would pursue all available legal remedies to protect community interests. I read it twice, feeling something shift in my chest. Not panic, not even anger yet, just a cold, clear understanding of what I was looking at. Diane wasn't just trying to avoid responsibility for the modifications she'd pushed through. She was trying to profit from them, divide the blame across 6 properties, collect whatever she could through intimidation and settlement, and use the money to rebuild while cementing her narrative about upstream negligence. I looked at the list of other recipients and realized the strategy immediately. Mrs. Patterson was in her 80s, living on a fixed income. She'd settle out of fear. The Johnsons were new, didn't understand HOA politics. The California investor would likely just pay to avoid the hassle of long-distance litigation. David Martinez had recently added a workshop to his property, which Diane could spin as drainage modification. The Castillo family ran a small business from their home. And me, the one who'd publicly opposed her, the one with documentation, the one who would be painted as obstructionist if I refused to pay while others settled. I sat down at my kitchen table and did what Maria would have told me to do. I got organized. Pulled out the county flood maps, the original drainage plans, the copy of Elena's report that James had given me, printed out every email I'd sent to the HOA about drainage concerns, every meeting minute where I'd raised objections, every response I'd received. Then I looked up the number James had mentioned once, back when he'd quit the modifications committee, an attorney in Tempe named David Castillo. James had said he was expensive, but he didn't lose, particularly when it came to HOA disputes. I called the office, expecting to leave a message. Instead, a receptionist put me through after I mentioned I'd received an HOA liability assessment. Miguel Herrera? The voice on the other end was younger than I expected, energetic. What did they hit you for? $285,000. They're calling it proportional upstream liability for flood damage. There was a pause, then a low whistle. Diane Castellano? You know her? Unfortunately, represented 2 families against her in the last 3 years. She backed down both times when we showed her she was violating Arizona statutes. He sounded like he was already taking notes. Tell me everything, starting with when you first opposed whatever modifications led to this. I talked for over an hour. He asked sharp questions, took me back over details, made me clarify timelines. When I got to the part about Elena's original report and her contract termination, I heard him stop writing. You have a copy of that report? James Morales gave it to me, the one she wrote before Diane fired her. That's good. That's very good. He was quiet for a moment. Miguel, I need to be direct with you. This is going to get complicated. Diane's not just trying to recoup losses. Based on what you're telling me, she's trying to deflect liability that probably belongs to the HOA itself. If her modifications cause the failure, she's personally exposed, the board members who voted for it are exposed, and the HOA's insurance coverage gets murky. So she's trying to make it my fault to protect herself, not just you. She's spreading it across 6 properties to make it look systematic rather than targeted, but it also means she's probably not expecting much of a fight. Most people will settle rather than risk a lawsuit. She's counting on that. I'm not settling. I know, that's why you called me. I could hear him shifting papers. First thing we do is file a response rejecting the assessment. Then we request all documentation supporting their damage calculations and their methodology for determining upstream responsibility. We force them to show their work, and if they refuse, then we file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate. HOAs have to follow specific procedures for special assessments. If they skipped steps or fabricated their engineering basis, they're in violation of state law. He paused. But Miguel, before we go down this road, you need to know something. Fighting this means fighting Diane directly. She's going to make your life difficult. Fines, violations, covenant enforcement. Whatever authority she has, she'll use it. She already doesn't like me. Might as well give her a good reason. David Castillo laughed, short and sharp. All right then, come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have. And Miguel, don't talk to anyone from the HOA without me present. Not Diane, not the board, not their lawyers. Everything goes through me now. After we hung up, I walked out to my back patio and looked at the mountains turning copper in the sunset, the same view Maria and I had watched together for over 2 decades. The next morning, I drove to David's office in Tempe. It was in a modest building near the university, professional but not flashy. His receptionist, the same woman who'd answered yesterday, greeted me by name and walked me straight back to his office. David Castillo looked younger than he'd sounded on the phone, maybe 40, with his shirt sleeves already rolled up and a tie that looked like it had been loosened shortly after he'd put it on. He stood and shook my hand with a grip that meant business. Miguel, good to meet you in person. Coffee? We spent the next 2 hours going through everything. He scanned Elena's report, photographed the flood maps, made copies of my correspondence with the HOA. When I showed him the assessment letter and the list of 6 properties, he read it carefully, then set it down and leaned back. This is more aggressive than I expected, even from her. She's not trying to settle. She's trying to intimidate. He tapped the letter. See this language? Independent assessment? I guarantee you that assessor is someone she hired specifically to reach the conclusion she wanted. Proportional responsibility? There's no such thing in Arizona water law. She just made up that framework. So she's bluffing? Partially. The damages are real, but the liability theory is fiction. In Arizona, Property owners have limited responsibility for natural surface water flow. You can't be held liable for water that naturally crosses your property unless you deliberately concentrated it or redirected it in a way that increased harm to downstream properties. He pulled up something on one of his SRE monitors. Did you do anything to alter drainage on your property? I improved it. Dug swales to slow runoff, planted native vegetation for absorption, made it better, not worse. Then her case against you is dead on arrival. But she doesn't know I know that yet. He smiled. Here's what we're going to do. We file a comprehensive response rejecting the assessment and demanding documentation. But more importantly, we're going to request records on the modifications themselves. Permits, engineering approvals, board minutes, financial authorizations. We're going to make her defend the very changes that actually caused the problem. Won't she just stonewall? She'll try. But Arizona has strong HOA transparency laws. If she refuses to provide documents we're legally entitled to, we file a complaint with the state. That triggers an investigation. And she doesn't want that attention. He started making notes. I'm also going to reach out to Elena Ruiz. If she's willing to provide an expert opinion, we can use her original report to show that Diane was specifically warned this would happen. You think Elena will help? Depends on how burned she feels about getting fired for telling the truth. He looked up. But in my experience, engineers don't like seeing their warnings come true and then watching someone else get blamed for it. Over the next week, David moved methodically. He filed the response to the assessment, formally rejecting it and requesting detailed documentation. He submitted public records requests for all board minutes, financial reports, and correspondence related to the drainage modifications. He contacted Elena Ruiz to discuss the possibility of her providing expert testimony. Diane's attorney, a lawyer named Russell Harrison, who apparently specialized in HOA representation, responded to each request with objections. The damage calculations were proprietary work product. The engineering methodology was covered by attorney-client privilege. The board minutes contained confidential deliberations. David knocked down each objection with citations to Arizona statutes, filing formal complaints when Harrison continued to stonewall. Within 10 days, we had partial compliance. Board minutes with heavy redactions, financial reports showing the costs of the modifications but not the decision-making process, and a memo from Harrison warning that continued harassment of the HOA through frivolous records requests would result in sanctions, but we didn't have the engineering reports. We didn't have the contractor agreements. She's hiding something, David said during one of our meetings. The more she blocks access, the more certain I am that there's something in those records she really doesn't want anyone to see. Can we force her to turn them over? Eventually, yes. But it'll take time, court orders, appeals, enforcement actions. She's betting most people won't want to invest that kind of effort for a case they can settle and move on from. He looked at me directly. Are you prepared for this to take months? I'm prepared for however long it takes. Good. Because I think it's about to get personal. He was right. 3 days later, I received a notice of covenant violation. According to the compliance committee, my front yard landscaping was non-compliant due to excessive use of native desert vegetation in areas designated for formal landscaping. The fine was $50 per day, with correction defined as removing the desert plants and installing appropriate ornamental species from an approved list. The same native plants I'd had for 15 years. 2 days after that, another notice. My work truck violated the commercial vehicle restriction because it displayed company information on the door panel, never mind that the restriction exempted vehicles under 3/4 ton. Never mind that I'd parked the same truck in the same spot for over a decade. The fine was $100 per day. The week after that, a letter informing me that my trash cans had been visible from the street at 7:15 p.m. on collection day, 15 minutes past the allowable time. Fine. $25. David had warned me this would happen. Diane was using every bit of authority she had to make my life difficult, hoping I'd give up and settle. But every frivolous fine, every manufactured violation, every petty enforcement action just made me more certain that I was right to fight. Keep copies of everything, David told me. Every notice, every fine, every communication. When this goes to a hearing, we're going to show that she's retaliating against you for refusing to accept the liability assessment. That's prohibited under Arizona law, and it's going to make her look very bad in front of a judge. Meanwhile, David finally managed to make contact with Elena Ruiz. She didn't want to meet at her office, so we arranged to see her at a coffee shop in Mesa on a Saturday morning. She looked tired when she walked in, like someone who'd been fighting quiet battles for too long. Early 50s, practical clothes, carrying a worn messenger bag. She shook both our hands but didn't smile. "I'm not sure how much help I can be," she said once. We'd sat down in a corner booth away from other customers. "I wrote my report. They ignored it. My contract ended. That was 14 months ago." "We have your original report," David said. "The one you wrote before they asked you to revise it." Her expression flickered. "How did you get that?" Someone on the committee who disagreed with the board's decision shared it, quietly. He slid a copy across the table. "Does this match what you submitted?" She flipped through it, and I watched her face tighten with recognition. "Yes, this is the full assessment, not the watered-down version they wanted." She looked up. "They told you what happened? That you were asked to revise your findings and refused. That your contract was terminated. That they hired someone else who approved the modifications." She nodded slowly. "His name was Gerald Booker. He's a civil engineer, technically qualified, but he specializes in cost reduction projects. He writes reports that tell clients what they want to hear." She tapped the document. "Everything in here is accurate. Eliminating Basin C removes 60% of the overflow capacity. Narrowing the main channel increases velocity and pressure. During any significant rainfall event, anything over 2 inches per hour, the system would be overwhelmed." I told them this explicitly. And Diane Castellano's response? She said cost overrides concern, that the aesthetic improvements were necessary for property values. That modern engineering had better solutions than outdated overflow basins. I told her that water doesn't care about aesthetics or property values. Water goes where physics tells it to go. She asked me to reconsider my findings. I declined. 2 days later, I received notice that my services were no longer required. David leaned forward. "Elena, would you be willing to provide expert testimony stating that the modifications Diane approved directly caused or materially contributed to the flooding severity?" She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the report. "You understand that if I do this, I'm effectively ending any chance of working with HOAs in this region again. They share information. They blacklist consultants who testify against them. I understand. And I wouldn't ask if there were another way. But right now, Diane is trying to blame 6 homeowners for damage that your report predicted would happen if she proceeded with these modifications. One of those homeowners is sitting right here." She looked at me for the first time. Really looked at me. "You're one of the upstream properties?" "Miguel Herrera. I'm the one who stood up at the meetings asking questions about the drainage changes. I remember hearing about you. Diane complained about you in one of our meetings. Said you were being obstructionist." Elena almost smiled. "Which told me you were probably the only one asking the right questions. They're asking me for $285,000. Saying I didn't maintain my property drainage adequately and that contributed to the flooding." Her expression hardened. "That's not how any of this works. Your property is uphill from the failure point. Unless you installed a pump system to force water downstream, which I'm guessing you didn't, you can't be responsible for a structural failure in the community's drainage system." She looked back at David. "Yes, I'll testify. Because what she's doing isn't just wrong. It's engineering malpractice, hiding behind administrative authority." We talked for another hour. Elena explained the technical details. As we were leaving, she stopped me. "Mr. Herrera, I need you to understand something. When this goes public, when my testimony becomes part of the record, Diane is going to fight back hard. She's going to question my credibility, my qualifications, my motivations. She's going to make this as ugly as possible. I know. Good. Because people like her don't accept responsibility. They just find new ways to deflect it." The next major development came from an unexpected direction. David had been building a network of information, talking to contractors who'd worked on the modifications, reviewing public records, following paper trails. One afternoon, he called me with excitement in his voice. "Miguel, do you know anything about a company called Morales Landscaping and Drainage?" "That's Derek Morales' company. He's on the HOA board compliance chair." "Right. Well, guess who got the contract for the Basin C elimination and channel modification work?" The implication hit me immediately. He voted on a project that he profited from? That's what it looks like. The board meeting minutes show a unanimous vote to approve the modifications, which means Derek voted yes on a contract that his own company then received. That's a textbook conflict of interest, and it's prohibited under Arizona HOA law. Did Diane know? She signed the contract authorization, so either she knew and didn't care, or she's incompetent. Neither option looks good for her. David was clearly pleased. I'm filing this with the state tomorrow. It won't directly affect your assessment, but it's going to trigger an investigation into the board's conduct. And that investigation is going to be very interested in why they approved modifications that their own engineer warned against, particularly when one board member stood to profit from the work. Will that stop the assessment? No, but it's going to make Diane's life significantly more complicated. She's trying to project authority and competence. Having the state investigate her for ethics violations undercuts that narrative. He paused. And Miguel, there's something else. I got a call this morning from David Martinez, the other upstream homeowner. The one they're asking for money? Yeah, he wants to know if you're fighting this, because if you are, he wants to join. He's got his own attorney, but he's willing to coordinate with us. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more of the targeted homeowners reached out. Not Mrs. Patterson, she'd already settled for $15,000. Not the California investor, he'd paid $40,000 just to make it go away. But the Johnsons, the Martinez family, and even the Castillo family on the east side, all of them had received the same letter, the same assessment, and all of them had started asking the same questions. David organized a meeting at his office. We all sat around his conference table, me, David Martinez, and his wife Linda, the Johnsons, and the Castillo patriarch. David Castillo, the attorney, stood at a whiteboard explaining what he'd learned. Here's what we know. The HOA sustained significant damage, probably between $1.5 and $2 million. Their insurance is going to cover most of that, but there's a deductible and there are coverage questions about whether the modifications voided certain policies. Diane needs someone else to blame, both to cover the gap and to deflect liability from her decision-making. He drew a diagram showing the upstream properties and the community center. The theory she's using upstream liability sounds technical, but it's basically made up. There's no provision in Arizona law that lets an HOA assess individual homeowners for damage to common property based on alleged inadequate maintenance. The only way she could pursue this is through individual lawsuits claiming negligence, which she'd have to prove in court. So why is she doing it this way? Linda Martinez asked. Because it's easier and cheaper. Send threatening letters, collect whatever settlement she can, avoid the cost and risk of actual litigation. Most people pay just to avoid the hassle. He looked around the table. But here's the thing. The more of you who refuse to pay, the harder her position becomes. She can't sue all of you. The legal costs would exceed whatever she'd collect, and she'd have to prove actual negligence, which, based on the engineering evidence, she can't do. What about the fines? The younger Mr. Castillo asked. Since we refused to pay, she's been hitting us with violation notices. Landscaping, vehicles, every little thing she can find. David nodded. That's retaliation, and it's illegal. We document every instance, and when this goes to court, we show that she's using her authority to punish people who exercise their legal right to dispute an improper assessment. That's going to look very bad for her. We agreed to coordinate our responses, share information, and present a unified front. Instead of 6 individual homeowners, easy to divide and intimidate, Diane was now facing an organized opposition with legal representation and documentation. The shift in dynamics was immediate. Within a week of David filing a consolidated response on behalf of all 5 remaining homeowners, Harrison sent a letter suggesting that the HOA was willing to discuss alternative resolution frameworks and that there may have been miscommunication about the assessment methodology. She's backing down, David told me over the phone. Not surrendering, but backing down. She's realizing this isn't going to be the easy collection she expected. So, what happens now? Now we press. She's vulnerable, and I want to find out why she's so desperate to collect this money quickly instead of just letting insurance handle everything. The answer came from an unexpected source. Paul Kendrick, the HOA treasurer who'd been Diane's shadow for 6 years, showed up at David's office requesting a confidential meeting. Without Diane, without Harrison. Just him and his own attorney, a woman who specialized in whistleblower protection. I wasn't present for that meeting, but David called me immediately afterward, and I could hear something new in his voice. Not excitement exactly, more like the sound of someone who'd just seen the full picture and didn't like what it showed. Miguel, this is bigger than the flood. Diane's been systematically diverting HOA funds for almost 4 years. Diverting them where? Everywhere. Fake vendor invoices, overpayment schemes, personal expenses run through community accounts. Paul estimates at least $400,000, maybe more. He's been tracking it for the last year. trying to figure out how to report it without destroying his own reputation. David's voice was tight. The reason she's pushing the upstream assessment so hard? She needs cash flow. The insurance company is auditing the financials before they release the full claim payment. If they find the discrepancies, they're not paying. Diane needs money fast to cover the gaps she created. She's trying to steal from homeowners to cover up the money she already stole. Essentially, yes. And Paul's ready to provide documentation, bank records, invoices, email chains, everything. He's terrified. But he's more terrified of going down with her when this collapses. Why now? Why didn't he come forward before? Because he thought he could fix it quietly. Thought Diane would stop. Thought the board would notice. But after the flood, when she immediately started targeting homeowners instead of addressing the actual infrastructure problems, he realized she was never going to stop. She was just going to keep finding new ways to cover old problems. The state investigation into Derek Morales' conflict of interest had already begun. Now, David filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Corporation Commission regarding financial irregularities, attaching Paul's documentation and requesting a full forensic audit. He also filed motions to freeze certain HOA accounts pending investigation. Everything started moving faster after that. The Arizona Department of Real Estate opened its own investigation. The HOA's insurance company put the claim payment on hold pending the audit. 2 more board members resigned rather than risk being associated with what was increasingly looking like systematic fraud. And Diane stopped responding to communication entirely. No more violation notices, no more assessment demands, just silence from the HOA office and terse no-comment responses from Harrison. The Desert Ridge newsletter, which Diane had controlled for 6 years, suddenly had a new editor after several homeowners complained. The new issue ran a front-page story. Board under investigation. Financial irregularities alleged in HOA management. I started seeing different reactions when I checked my mail or walked my dog. Some neighbors still avoided eye contact. Others stopped to talk. Some apologized for believing the initial narrative. A few admitted they'd had their own problems with Diane over the years but had been afraid to speak up. James Morales came by one evening with a 6-pack of beer and an apology he'd clearly been rehearsing. "Miguel, I should have backed you up from the start. I knew what she was doing was wrong, and I stayed quiet because it was easier. We sat on my back patio, the same spot where Maria and I used to watch the sunset. The wash was dry again, waiting patiently for the next monsoon. You spoke up when it mattered," I told him. "That's what counts. Still, you fought alone for a long time. Not alone. I thought about Elena, about David, about the other homeowners who'd chosen to fight. Just outnumbered for a while." The preliminary hearing on the assessment was scheduled for early November, almost 3 months after the flood. By the time we walked into that courtroom, the landscape had shifted completely. The state investigation had expanded. 2 separate engineering firms had reviewed the failed infrastructure, and both concluded that the elimination of Basin C and the channel narrowing had created the conditions for failure. Elena's supplemental report had been filed, and Paul Kendrick had provided documentation showing that Diane had authorized payment to Morales Landscaping in amounts that exceeded the contracted amount, with the excess being kicked back through a shell company she controlled. Judge Catherine Morrison reviewed the filings in silence before looking up. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench a long time. She'd clearly read everything carefully. "I've reviewed the assessment letters, the engineering reports, the financial documentation, and the expert testimony," she said. "Mr. Harrison, does the HOA still maintain that the upstream property owners bear liability for the flood damage?" Harrison stood, and for the first time, he looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, in light of new information that has come to light regarding the community's infrastructure modifications, the HOA wishes to withdraw the assessment and resolve this matter through alternative means." "That's not an answer, Counselor. Yes or no?" "No, Your Honor. Then the assessment is void, and all demands for payment are withdrawn with prejudice." Judge Morrison's tone left no room for argument. "Furthermore, I'm referring the financial documentation to the county attorney for review. Misappropriation of HOA funds is a criminal matter in Arizona, and the evidence presented suggests that warrants investigation." Diane's face had gone pale. She started to stand, but Harrison put a hand on her arm. She shook him off and walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "I'm also ordering the HOA to reimburse all legal fees incurred by the property owners in defending against these assessments. The targeting of individual homeowners to cover infrastructure failures that the board itself created through improper modifications represents a serious abuse of HOA authority. The Arizona Department of Real Estate will receive a full copy of these proceedings for their ongoing investigation. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Several homeowners were already pulling out their phones. But I knew it wasn't quite done yet. Criminal investigations take time. Financial audits take longer. Over those months, the full scope of what Diane had been doing unraveled. The county attorney brought charges, fraud, theft, misuse of HOA funds. Derek Morales was charged as a co-conspirator. The HOA's insurance company filed a civil suit. Gerald Booker lost his license. Morales Landscaping went bankrupt. Paul Kendrick received immunity in exchange for testimony. The board was dissolved and replaced with a court-appointed receiver. When new elections were finally held, James Morales ran for president on a platform of transparency and accountability. He won by a landslide. The criminal case took almost a year. Diane eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation, community service, and restitution. She avoided prison. The drainage system was rebuilt according to Elena's original specifications. Basin C was restored. The narrow channel was expanded. The work cost almost $900,000, paid for by insurance, with remaining liability falling on the HOA's reserve funds. Not on upstream homeowners. Mrs. Patterson, who'd settled for $15,000 out of fear, got her money back with interest. The California investor who'd paid $40,000 filed a civil suit and eventually collected triple damages. Every homeowner who'd been targeted received formal apologies from the new board and reimbursement for any fines they'd paid during Diane's retaliation campaign. But the community itself remained changed in ways that couldn't be repaired easily. There was no single moment when everyone came together and healed. Some people never apologized. They simply pretended the whole thing hadn't happened. About 30% of the neighborhood just moved on without acknowledgement. Others offered awkward half-apologies. We didn't know the whole story. We were just going by what the board told us. We should have asked more questions. They meant well, but their discomfort was obvious. A smaller group, maybe 20%, made genuine efforts at reconciliation. They admitted they'd been wrong, that they'd jumped to conclusions, that they'd let Diane manipulate them. Some of these conversations happened on doorsteps, some in chance meetings at the grocery store, some through carefully written letters, and a few people became real allies. James, obviously. The Martinez family. Young Mr. Castillo, who joined the new architectural committee and fought to eliminate some of the more restrictive covenants. Elena Ruiz, who I stayed in touch with. David Castillo, the attorney, who became something like a friend. But Maria's absence felt sharper during all of this. She would have known how to navigate the social complexity better than I did, would have known which neighbors needed space and which ones needed encouragement to reconnect, would have reminded me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it also doesn't mean holding on to anger. I thought about her often during those months, especially on evenings when I sat on the back patio watching the mountains turn colors. Sometimes I'd pour 2 beers out of habit, then realize she wasn't there. One evening, about 8 months after the hearing, James stopped by with his wife Carol. We sat outside as the day cooled down, talking about the upcoming monsoon season, the first since the flood. The rebuilt drainage system had been tested with smaller storms. "You ever think about moving?" James asked. After everything that happened, would have been understandable. I looked at the mountains, the wash, the garden where Maria's roses still bloomed every April. This is my home. Has been for 23 years. I'm not letting what Diane did take that away from me. Carol nodded. Still, must be hard living here after the way some people treated you. Some people? I agreed. Not all, and the ones who matter found their way to the right side eventually. The monsoon season came right on schedule in mid-July. When the first real storm hit, not as severe as the one that had caused the flood, but substantial, the rebuilt system handled it exactly as designed. Basin C filled gradually, the expanded channel moved water efficiently downstream, and the overflow dispersed into designated areas instead of flooding the community center. I watched it from my back patio, rain coming down in sheets, and felt something close to peace. Not because everything was perfect, not because all the damage had been repaired, but because the system worked the way it should have worked all along. Because truth had eventually surfaced. Because water followed the laws of physics. The Desert Ridge newsletter ran a small piece about the successful test of the new drainage system. James had ensured the article included a note thanking Elena Ruiz for her engineering expertise and acknowledging that her original recommendations had been vindicated. I still get questions sometimes from neighbors or from people in other communities who heard about what happened. They want to know how I knew to fight instead of settle, how I found the courage to stand up to someone who had institutional power, how I managed to see through the narrative when so many others didn't. The truth is simpler and less heroic than they usually want to hear. I fought because I knew I was right. I fought because Maria had taught me that being quiet doesn't mean being weak. I fought because the alternative was accepting a lie that would have cost me everything I'd worked for. And I fought because water doesn't lie. Physics doesn't care about HOA, politics, or property values. When a drainage system fails, it fails according to natural laws. When a flood happens, it happens because pressure exceeded capacity. Diane had understood power and authority. She'd been smart enough to plan her deflection before the disaster even happened, but she'd forgotten that some things can't be manipulated. On a warm October evening, almost 14 months after that monsoon, I stood in my driveway looking at the house Maria and I had built our life in. The roses she'd planted were preparing for dormancy. The mountains were turning purple in the fading light. The wash was dry and peaceful, waiting for the water that would eventually come again. I'd won. The assessment was voided. The lawsuit never filed. The criminal charges brought against the people actually responsible. My legal fees had been reimbursed. My reputation had been restored, but I'd also lost things that couldn't be quantified. The easy comfort of community. The assumption of goodwill from neighbors who'd believe the worst without evidence. The naive trust that people in positions of authority would act with integrity. Some wounds heal cleaner than others. Some relationships can be rebuilt, but some things, once broken, leave cracks that never quite disappear. Standing there in the cooling evening air, I thought about what Maria would say if she could see how it had all turned out. She'd probably tell me I'd done the right thing the hard way, which was the only way worth doing it. She'd remind me that integrity costs something, but the alternative costs more, and she'd point out that the wash was still there, unchanged, a reminder that some things endure regardless of human drama. I don't own the water that flows through this valley when the rains come, but I made damn sure the truth didn't drown with the lies people tried to float. The sun dropped below the mountains. The temperature started its nightly plunge. And I walked back inside my house, closing the door on a chapter that had tested everything I thought I knew about community, authority, and the price of standing alone when standing alone is necessary. The wash would be there tomorrow, and the day after. And long after all of us and our petty conflicts had turned to dust, patient and persistent,